She had one rule for surviving in that house. Be invisible. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't linger. Don't be seen. She broke it in 30 seconds, humming a song from home to an empty room she thought no one was in. She was wrong. A boy who hadn't spoken, danced, or looked another human being in the eye for 3 years was standing in the doorway behind her, moving. And behind him, a man the whole city was afraid of stood frozen, watching his son come back to life because of a stranger with a cleaning cloth in her hand. By morning, that man gave an order nobody in his house had heard him give before. Not a punishment, not a warning, but something far more dangerous to a woman who'd already lost everything once. Bring that girl to me. She had survived losing her parents. She had survived starting over in a country that didn't want her. What she hadn't survived yet was being wanted by the one man in Seoul powerful enough to take everything, or give her more than she ever thought she'd have again. The hall was empty. That was the only reason she dared. Amahle Dlamini moved between the long banquet tables with a cloth in one hand and a half-filled trash bag in the other, candle wax cooling under her fingers, the chandeliers dimmed to a low gold that made the room feel like it was holding its breath. The party had ended 2 hours ago. The guests, men in dark suits who never quite smiled with their eyes, had gone. What was left was crumbs, empty glasses, and a silence so total she could hear her own shoes on the marble. She hummed before she meant to. A church song from Durban, the kind her mother used to sing over a pot of stew, low and rolling, more rhythm than melody. Her hips picked it up before her mind caught on. A turn, a step. The cloth in her hand became, for 30 seconds, the only audience she needed. She did not hear the door. She did not see the boy who never came near strangers cross the threshold, drawn by a sound he hadn't heard since before his mother died. She did not see his shoulders start to move. She turned, mid-step, laughing at herself, and stopped breathing. 10-year-old Kang Jun-woo was dancing. In the doorway behind him, a man in a charcoal suit stood frozen, a glass of untouched whiskey forgotten in his hand, watching his son move for the first time in 3 years. By morning, Kang Min-jae, a man feared by judges, police chiefs, and rival bosses across Seoul, gave an order that would undo everything he'd spent a decade building around his heart. Bring that girl to me. If you're already hooked, you know what to do. Like this video, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe, because what happens after that order is given is going to wreck you in the best way. Let's get into it. 2 guards came for her before her shift even started, and Amahle's first thought, the one that turned her stomach to water, was that she was being deported. She had heard the stories from the other domestic workers at church on Sundays, the Filipina nanny who'd been sent home over a broken vase, the Vietnamese cook who'd vanished from a different house overnight. No goodbye, no explanation. Mr. Kang's mansion ran on rules nobody wrote down, and Amahle had learned them the way you learn the edge of a cliff in the dark, carefully, by feel, terrified of the one step that would teach her too late. She followed the guards down a hallway she'd polished 100 times and had never once been allowed to walk slowly through. Her reflection passed in window after window. 24 years old, hair wrapped tight, uniform pressed, hands that hadn't stopped shaking since they'd knocked on her door at 6 in the morning. She thought of her mother's voice, the one that used to tell her not to flinch when life pushed. She thought of the email from Mrs. Park 8 months ago. There is a household in Seoul. They need someone reliable, someone with a steady heart. Sent 2 weeks after Amahle had buried both her parents in the same week, a truck in a wet road on the N2 taking everything she had left in South Africa except a name and a faith she was holding on to by the fingernails. She thought of the plane ticket she'd paid for with the last of her father's pension, of landing in Incheon, not knowing a word of Korean beyond 안녕하세요, of the church basement where Mrs. Park had pressed both her hands and said, "God doesn't waste a journey, child, even this one." She had wanted, badly, to believe that. Now she stood outside double doors taller than her father's whole house had been, and a guard pushed them open, and she understood she was about to find out whether Mrs. Park had been right, or whether the road had run out again. Kang Min-jae did not look up right away. He sat behind a desk of black lacquered wood, a single photograph turned slightly away from the door, a window behind him filling the room with gray morning light. He was younger than the rumors made him sound. 38, maybe. Though his stillness aged him. The kind of stillness Amahale had only ever seen in men who'd had to learn it to survive something. "Sit," he said, in English, accented but precise. She sat. He studied her the way she imagined he studied ledgers, for the place where the numbers didn't add up. "My staff tell me you were dancing in my banquet hall last night." Her mouth went dry. "I'm sorry, sir. I thought the room was empty." My son hasn't danced since his mother died." He said it flatly, the way you'd report a fact about weather, but something underneath it cracked just slightly, just enough for her to hear. 3 years, doctors, specialists flown in from Tokyo, from Boston. Nothing. He turned the photograph on his desk 1 inch further away from her, a small, private motion. "And you did it cleaning up after a dinner party." "I didn't do anything, sir. I was just—" She stopped herself, unsure which truth was safe to give him. "I was singing a song from home. He must have liked the sound." For a long moment, Min-jae said nothing, and the silence in that office was its own kind of language, the kind where what isn't said weighs more than what is. "I'm reassigning you," he said finally. "Effective today. You'll work with Jun-woo. Full hours, whatever he needs." Relief came so fast it nearly buckled her knees, followed almost immediately by a fear shaped differently than the first one. "Sir, I'm not trained for... I'm a housemaid I don't know anything about." "Neither do the people I've paid to know," Min-jae said, and for the first time something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere in the space between them. "Last night he danced. That's more than 3 years of training has done. I don't need your credentials, Miss Dlamini. I need whatever you did last night to happen again." He said her name correctly. She noticed that. Most people in this house didn't bother. "Mr. Choi will show you to his wing," Min-jae said, already looking back down at his papers, already somewhere else, already a man who'd given an order and expected the world to simply comply. "Don't make me regret this." She stood, legs unsteady, and was nearly to the door when his voice stopped her. "Miss Dlamini." She turned. He hadn't looked up. "Thank you," he said. So quietly she almost missed it, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth, like a language he hadn't spoken in years. She walked out into a hallway that suddenly felt less like a cliff edge and more like a doorway, though she had no way yet of knowing what was waiting on the other side of it. Jun-woo's room looked like no 10-year-old's room Amahale had ever imagined. Sparse, ordered, almost clinical, toys arranged by color on shelves nobody touched, a weighted blanket folded with hospital corners on a bed that looked slept in but not lived in. The boy himself sat cross-legged on the floor by the window, rocking faintly, his eyes fixed on something past the glass that only he could see. He did not look at her when she entered. Mrs. Han, the head housekeeper, stood in the doorway with her arms folded and a face that made it clear exactly what she thought of a maid being promoted over girls who'd worked in this house for a decade. "Don't touch him unless he reaches first," she said, each word clipped. "Don't raise your voice. Don't stand too close. If he screams, you leave the room. You do not try to calm him. You do not touch him. You call the doctor." She looked Amahal over once, top to bottom, and found her wanting. "You won't last the week." The door shut. Amahale was alone with a boy who hadn't acknowledged her existence. She didn't sit near him. She sat by the door instead, knees pulled up, and after a while, not trying, not performing, simply because the silence pressed on her chest, the way it always had since the funeral, she began to hum the same song from the night before, soft, almost to herself. Jun-woo's rocking slowed. She kept humming. She didn't look at him directly. Some instinct, maybe memory of her cousin's boy back home who flinched from stares, told her not to. She looked instead at her own hands, at the window, at the dust motes turning gold in the afternoon light, and let the song carry whatever it wanted to carry. When she finally glanced over, 20 minutes later, Jun-woo had shifted 3 inches closer. It wasn't much. To anyone else in that house, it would have looked like nothing at all. To Amahal, it felt like the first real door she'd opened since she'd landed in this country. She didn't know yet that somewhere in this mansion, a man named Oh Tae-sung had already heard about the reassignment and was already, very quietly, beginning to worry. The first month built itself in small, stubborn inches. Amahale learned that Junwoo liked rhythm more than melody, that sudden Korean voices made him flinch, but the low, rolling cadence of her South African accent didn't seem to register as a threat the same way. She learned that he hated being touched without warning, but would, after enough repetition, let her hand rest an inch from his on the floor, palms open, an invitation rather than a demand. She learned to read the difference between his silences, the heavy one before a meltdown, the lighter one when he was simply listening. She also learned, faster than she wanted to, that not everyone in the house was glad she'd been promoted. "You think because the boy likes you, you belong here?" Mrs. Han said one evening, finding Amahale in the kitchen heating milk the way Junwoo liked it. Warm, never hot, always in the blue cup. "Girls before you have tried. Doctors with degrees from places you couldn't spell. They all left in the end. This family eats people, Miss Dlamini. It chews slow, but it eats." Amahale said nothing. She had learned, in 8 months of living far from home, that some battles weren't worth the breath. But 2 weeks later, walking past Min Jae's study with a tray she hadn't been asked to bring, she heard voices through the door left slightly open. Min Jae's, low and controlled, and another man's, smoother, almost soothing, the kind of voice that sounded reasonable saying terrible things. "A foreign girl with no training, Min Jae. I understand the boy seemed happy. Children respond to novelty. It will fade, as it always does, and you'll have given a stranger access to things she has no business seeing." "He danced, Taesung." Min Jae's voice had an edge to it Amahale hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, something closer to a wound being pressed. 3 years. You were there for every appointment that went nowhere. Don't tell me what's real and what isn't. I only want what's best for Junwoo. And for you. A pause, warm and careful as a hand on a shoulder. You've trusted me with everything since Seo-yeon passed. I'd hate to see that trust misplaced now, on someone we know nothing about. Amahale moved on, before she could hear more, heart loud in her ears, the tray suddenly heavy in her hands. She didn't know the man's face yet. She would learn it soon enough. Oh Tae-sung, silver-templed, soft-spoken, the kind of man who held doors open and remembered everyone's birthday, and had, for 3 years, been quietly deciding what Min Jae was allowed to believe about his own son. She didn't know, either, that the same man's name sat buried in a ledger 2 floors below her, attached to a wire transfer made 12 years earlier to a small school in Durban, South Africa. A school she had once walked 4 kilometers to attend, in shoes a half size too small, paid for by a fund she had never once thought to ask the name of. She only knew, standing in that hallway with a milk-stained tray, that something in this house did not want her to stay. She decided, quietly, stubbornly, that she would anyway. 3 weeks after that, Junwoo said his first word to her. They were in the garden, late afternoon. Amahale teaching him a clapping game her mother used to play with her on the stoep back home. 2 beats, a pause, a slap of the palms, repeat. He'd been resisting it for days, watching from a careful distance, hands pressed to his ears whenever she clapped too loud. She'd learned to clap softer. She'd learned to wait. That afternoon, without warning, his small hands came up and met hers in the air. "Mo," he said. Not quite a word. The shape of one trying to be born. She froze, afraid that breathing wrong might break whatever had just happened. "Mo, Ray," he tried again, the second syllable dragging like it cost him something physical to produce. More, Amahale repeated, soft, steady, her eyes burning in a way she refused to let fall into tears in front of him. "You want more, Junwoo?" He clapped his hands together once, hard, and for the first time since she'd arrived in this house, he looked directly at her, not past her, not through her, at her, his dark eyes holding hers for 1 full second before sliding away again. 1 second. It felt like the longest second of her life. She didn't tell Min Jae that night. She wanted, selfishly, to keep it for herself a little longer. This thing that belonged only to her, and a boy who'd just decided, in his own time and his own language, that she was someone worth speaking to. She told him 3 days later, when Junwoo said it again, twice, unprompted, reaching for her hand at breakfast, and Min Jae, summoned by the housekeeper because something was different, and nobody in that house could explain anything different without him, stood in the doorway and watched his son say a word to a woman he'd known for less than 2 months. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, His voice wasn't the boardroom voice, the cold ledger voice. It was smaller than that. "Say it again," he said, and Amaha understood he wasn't speaking to her. Junwoo, miraculously, did. Min Jae's hand found the doorframe like he needed it to stay upright. He didn't cross the room. He didn't reach for his son. Some instinct in him, hard-won and painful, knew not to crowd the moment. He simply stood there and watched, and Amahale, glancing up, caught something on his face she suspected very few people in his world had ever been allowed to see. It looked like a man remembering, for one unguarded second, what hope felt like before he'd learned to distrust it. She found him 3 weeks later in a room she hadn't known existed, a small room at the far end of the east wing, the kind of room a family stops walking into because walking into it costs too much. She'd gone looking for spare blankets and opened the wrong door. Min Jae sat on the floor in the dark, a child's stuffed rabbit in his lap, a framed photograph in his hand. He hadn't heard her. For one terrible, intimate second, she saw him the way no guard, no rival, no government official ever had. Shoulders curved in like something inside him had given way, face wet in the gray moonlight, a man entirely alone with a grief he never let anyone witness. As she should have left. She told herself, later, that she should have left. Instead, she stood frozen in the doorway, and the floorboard beneath her shifted, and he turned. Neither of them spoke. He didn't reach to wipe his face. Some part of him seemed past the point of pretending. She didn't apologize, didn't retreat, didn't do any of the things you're supposed to do when you walk in on a powerful man's worst moment. She set the rabbit gently back on the edge of the small bed where it had clearly fallen, and said only, she must have loved this room very much. A long breath left him. She kept it for him, even after he outgrew needing it. She could never bring herself to clear it out. His thumb moved once over the photograph's edge. A woman laughing, sunlight in her hair, a version of grief Amahle would never get to ask the name of. I used to think love this big would protect us from anything. His voice didn't break exactly. It just went very quiet. It didn't protect her, and for 3 years I haven't known how to protect him either. You're protecting him, Amahal said. Just not the way you think you should. He looked at her then, really looked, the way Junwoo had started to, like he was deciding, slowly, painfully, whether it was safe to be seen. She left without another word. She didn't tell him she'd left a cup of warm tea on the hallway table outside his study the next morning, untouched, unexplained, the same way her own mother used to leave tea outside doors that needed quiet, more than questions. He drank it anyway. She noticed the cup, empty, the following day. Neither of them spoke of the room again, but something in the house had shifted, quiet as a held breath, and both of them, in their own private and unspoken way, knew it. It was a wet Tuesday afternoon, 3 months into her new assignment, when Min Jae asked Amahle to help clear out his late wife's old study. Boxes of papers nobody had touched since the funeral, a task he'd clearly been avoiding for 3 years, and finally, for reasons he didn't explain, felt ready to face. You don't have to read any of it, he said, setting the last box on the desk. Just sort what's worth keeping from what isn't. Amahal worked alone through the afternoon, sun sliding lower through tall windows, paper dust thick in the light. Most of it was ordinary. Old receipts, design sketches for the garden Seo Yun had never finished planting, a half-written letter to a sister in Busan. And then, near the bottom of the third box, a manila folder, soft with age, photographs spilling loose when she lifted it. Children in school uniforms, standing in rows in front of a building she knew the way you know your own hands. Durban, her old primary school. Faded, slightly overexposed, the kind of photo a proud headmaster keeps in his office. Her breath went thin. She was in it, 12 years old, front row, gap-toothed, hair in 2 stubborn plaits her mother had fought her over that morning. Her hands shook as she dug deeper into the folder. A ledger page, handwritten. Hanbit Ubuntu Children's Fund. A list of scholarship names, 3rd from the bottom. Aid Lamini, tuition, uniforms, books, fully funded. She sat down hard on the floor, the folder pressed to her chest, and let herself cry the way she hadn't let herself cry since the funeral. Not from grief this time, but from something stranger, something closer to being found. She didn't hear the door. She only knew Min Jae was there when his shadow fell across the photographs scattered at her feet. "What is it?" His voice had gone careful, the way it did now whenever something mattered. She held the photo up, hand still trembling. "This is my school. Sir, this is me." Her finger found her 12-year-old face. "Your wife paid for my education. I never knew her name. I never knew anyone's name. I just knew somebody, somewhere, decided I was worth the money, and I swore I'd make it count." Her voice cracked open on the last word. It was her. The whole time, it was her. Min Jae knelt slowly, took the ledger page from her hands, read it twice like he didn't trust his own eyes the first time. Something in his face came undone, in a way she hadn't seen even in that small room upstairs. Not grief this time, but a kind of disbelieving wonder, the universe folding itself into a shape too strange and too kind to be coincidence. "She never told me the names," he said quietly. "She said it would feel like keeping score, and she didn't want that." He looked up at Amahale, and for the first time, the careful distance between them, employer and employee, boss and stranger, seemed to dissolve entirely. "She funded your education 12 years ago, and 12 years later, you walked into my banquet hall and made my son dance for the first time since she died." Neither of them said the word that hung in the room. Neither of them needed to. It was while she was tucking the ledger pages back into the folder, hands still unsteady, that something else caught her eye. A column of figures, transfer amounts, dates, and beside several of them, the same signature, neat and practiced. Oh Tae-sung, financial administrator. The numbers in the column didn't match the numbers in the letters stapled behind them, letters from the school in Durban, thanking the fund for amounts smaller, in several cases, than what the ledger claimed had been sent. She didn't understand yet what she was looking at. She only knew, with the same instinct that had once told her not to stand too close to Junwoo too fast, that something here was wrong, and that the name signed beside the wrongness was a name she'd already heard once, through a half-open study door, telling Min Jae not to trust her. She closed the folder. She didn't say anything yet. Some part of her, the part that had survived 8 months alone in a foreign country, told her to be very, very sure before she lit a fire she couldn't control. She had no idea the fire was already lit, and that somewhere in this house, Oh Tae-sung had just learned exactly which boxes had been opened that afternoon. He came to find her 2 days later, in the garden, while Junwoo napped. Oh Tae-sung, smiling the way he always smiled, like a man who'd never once had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. "Miss Lamini, I hear you've been a great help, clearing out Mrs. Kang's old papers." His eyes didn't quite match his mouth. Such delicate work. Family history is fragile. One has to be careful what gets misread. "I'm only sorting, sir," Amahal said carefully. "Nothing more." Of course. He studied her a beat too long. Min Jae trusts easily when it comes to his son. It's his one blind spot. I've spent years protecting him from people who'd take advantage of that. His voice stayed warm, almost kind, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. I'd hate for anyone new in this house to mistake his kindness for an open door. He left before she could answer, and Amaho stood alone among the roses, certain, suddenly, that she had just been warned, politely, smilingly, unmistakably warned, and that whatever she'd found in that ledger, she had not imagined the danger of it. She didn't sleep well that night. She kept the folder hidden beneath her mattress, the way she used to hide her father's old watch from cousins who borrowed and never returned things, and told herself she would find the right moment to bring it properly to Min Jae, not as gossip, not as accusation, but as truth, laid out clean enough that no one could twist it. She never got the chance to choose that moment herself. 3 days later, security found stolen family financial documents in her room, papers she'd never seen before, planted with the kind of care that only comes from someone who's done this before. And by the time Min Jae arrived in the doorway, face unreadable, 2 guards already had her by the arms. "Sir, I didn't take anything, I swear to you, Where did these come from then?" Oh Tae-sung's voice, behind Min Jae's shoulder, gentle as a blade slipped in sideways. "Sensitive account records. Information about offshore transfers nobody outside this family should have. Found in her room. Min Jae. I'm so sorry. I know how much you'd come to trust her." Min Jae's eyes went to Amaho's, and for one unbearable second she watched something close behind them. Not hatred, not even certainty, but something far worse. Doubt. Take her to the front gate, he said, voice flat, controlled, a voice she hadn't heard since the very first morning in his office. Call the police. Let them sort out what's true. Min Jae, she started, and stopped, because his face had already turned away from her, because somewhere down the hall, a small voice had begun to scream her name, and there was nothing in this house, in this country, in this entire life she'd tried so hard to build from nothing, that was going to stop what came next. Junwoo's screaming followed her all the way down the staircase, raw and broken in a way she'd never heard from him before, not even in his worst early days. Amahle, Amahle. Her name, learned from her own mouth, used now to beg her not to leave. She turned once, at the door, guards' hands tight on her arms, and saw him at the top of the stairs, breaking from the housekeeper's grip, reaching for a railing he was too small to see over, his face, the face of a child watching the only safe thing in his world get taken away. I didn't do anything, she said, to no one, to everyone, to the cold morning air as the gate shut behind her. I didn't do anything wrong. Nobody answered. The gate, heavy and final, clicked shut on a life she had only just begun to believe in. She slept that first night on a church pew in Itaewon, the same congregation that had welcomed her 8 months ago, Mrs. Park's hand on her shoulder the only steady thing in a world that had gone sideways. The police had questioned her for 6 hours and released her without charge. The documents, it turned out, didn't quite hold together under examination, the chain of evidence too convenient, too clean. But the damage to her name, to her place in that house, had already been done the moment Min Jae watched 2 guards lead her out his own front gate. He hadn't called. He hadn't sent word. In the eyes of a man who ran an empire on instinct and information, she had become, simply, a risk he'd chosen not to take. She flew home to Durban 2 weeks later, on a ticket Mrs. Park insisted on paying for, the city's heat hitting her like an old friend's too tight hug the moment she stepped off the plane, the ocean smell, the particular gold of a South African winter afternoon. She told herself, over and over on that flight, that it was over. That whatever had bloomed in that mansion, with that boy, with that man standing in a small room upstairs with his grief unguarded, had simply been a season, and seasons end. She didn't yet know that 2,000 kilometers away, a 10-year-old boy had stopped eating. In the Kang mansion, the silence that fell after Amahle's departure was the kind Min Jae remembered too well, the kind that had filled the house after Seo Yun died, thick and total. The kind no amount of money or fear had ever managed to fix. Junwoo stopped speaking entirely within 3 days. He wouldn't leave his room. He pushed food away untouched, refused the blue cup, refused the clapping game, refused, most of all, to look at his father at all, as though Min Jae himself had become one more stranger to be avoided. Mrs. Han found Min Jae outside his son's door one evening, forehead pressed to the wood, unmoving. "Sir," she said quietly, "perhaps we were wrong about the girl." "The evidence was real," Min Jae said, though his voice carried none of the certainty the words demanded. "The evidence was convenient," Mrs. Han said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "I've worked in this house 11 years, Mr. Kang. I didn't like her at first either, but I never once saw that girl take anything that wasn't freely given. Not even your son's trust. She earned that, slowly, the hard way, the way nobody else managed in 3 years." Min Jae said nothing. But that night, for the first time, he pulled the financial documents from the case against Amahle and read them again, properly, the way he should have the first time, not as a man protecting his son from a threat, but as a man who'd built an empire on knowing when numbers lied. He found the first inconsistency at 2 in the morning, a signature timestamp that didn't match the security log, a document supposedly discovered in Amahale's room that had been filed, digitally, 4 hours before the search that found it. His hand went very still on the page. It was 2 days after that, in the hush before dawn, that Junwoo did something nobody in that house expected. He walked, on his own, out of his room for the first time in 5 days, past Mrs. Han, past the breakfast no one had managed to coax him toward, and found his father in the study, and stood in the doorway until Min Jae looked up. "Junwoo." "Amahle didn't lie," the boy said. 5 words, plain, deliberate, each one carrying the weight of everything he hadn't been able to say in 3 years of silence. the clearest sentence he had spoken in his entire life. Min Jae's pen fell from his hand. "Amahel didn't lie," Junwoo said again, louder this time, his small fists curling at his sides, eyes wet but holding his father's gaze, holding it the way Amahel had taught him, slow and patient, an inch at a time. "Bring her back." Min Jae crossed the room and knelt in front of his son, the way he hadn't let himself kneel in front of anyone in years, and for the first time since So-yeon's funeral, he let his son see him afraid. "I will," he said. "I promise you, I will." He stood, and something in him that had been frozen for 3 years, finally, fully, broke open. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had every account told Oh Tae-sung had ever touched, pulled from the family's servers, every signature cross-referenced, every wire transfer to a small foundation in South Africa laid out across his desk like a crime scene, because that, he understood now, with a cold clarity that frightened even him, was exactly what it was. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't slowing down from here. So before we go any further, hit subscribe and drop a comment with the word you think Min Jae is about to hear from his own organization, because what he's about to uncover is bigger and uglier than even he expected. Now let's get into it. The numbers told a story 12 years deep. Min Jae sat through the night with Mr. Choi, his most trusted guard, cross-referencing wire transfers against school records faxed over, at his urgent request, from a headmaster in Durban who remembered the Hanbit Ubuntu Fund well. Remembered, too, the years its donations had thinned without explanation, the letters of gratitude that went unanswered, the scholarship slots quietly cut from 40 to 12 to 4. Every discrepancy led back to the same signature. Worse, far worse, were the medical files. 3 years of Junwoo's specialist reports, each one signed off by a Dr. Yoon whose practice, it turned out, had been almost entirely funded by referral payments from a single source, Oh Tae-sung. Reports calling Junwoo's case unlikely to respond to intervention, recommending costly, ultimately useless treatments, each invoice padded, each consultation a little more expensive than the last, every dead end quietly, profitably, manufactured. Min Jae read his son's medical history laid bare in front of him, 3 years of hope sold back to him in installments by a man he'd called a friend, and understood, with a sick, slow horror, that Oh Tae-sung had never wanted Junwoo to get better. A boy who progressed was a boy who no longer needed expensive specialists. A family that stopped grieving was a family that started asking questions. About money, about old charity accounts, about a wife who, Min Jae now remembered with a different kind of grief entirely, had died of heart failure 2 days after a furious locked-door argument with Tae-sung that no one in the house had ever explained. She'd found it. Min Jae understood that now, sitting alone at 4 in the morning, with 12 years of fraud spread across his desk. So-yeon had found the discrepancy in her own charity's books before she died, had confronted the man she trusted with it, and the stress of that fight, of being lied to by someone she'd let close to her family, had very likely been the final blow to a heart that, the doctors said at the time, simply gave out. He had spent 3 years blaming nothing. Now he had a name. He called Mr. Choi to assemble what he needed, not violence, he was careful to specify, not the old ways, not anymore, not with everything now at stake, but evidence, witnesses, a paper trail clean enough to hand directly to the Financial Crimes Division that had been quietly investigating Korea's shadow economy for years, and had never once been able to touch a man as careful as Oh Tae-sung. Until now. In a small house at the edge of Durban, her aunt's place, 2 rooms and a tin roof that sang in the rain, Amahel had begun, slowly, to put her soul life away. She'd taken a job at the school where the Hanbit Ubuntu photograph had been taken, helping in the front office, the headmaster kind enough not to ask too many questions about why a girl with a Korean employment visa had come home so suddenly, so thin around the eyes. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after her flight home, when her aunt mentioned, almost in passing, that there'd been calls, international numbers, unanswered, 3 of them in 2 days. Could be anyone, her aunt said, stirring the pot. Spam, maybe. Don't worry yourself. Amahel didn't worry herself. She told herself that very firmly, the way you tell yourself the truth you need rather than the one your chest is arguing with. But that night, Lying under the tin roof's familiar rain song, she let herself imagine, just once, what it would mean if it wasn't spam. If it was him. And in the same breath, she made herself imagine the gate closing behind her again. Jun Woo's screaming, Min Jae's face turning away. The particular, bottomless humiliation of being someone's convenient mistake. She thought about the job in the front office. Steady, safe. 3 meals a day and a roof that, while it sang too loud in storms, had never once locked her out. She thought about never answering a Korean number again, just letting it ring through. The way you let an old wound close over, rather than reopening it to see if it had healed clean. She almost did it. She had her phone in her hand the next morning, the unknown number lighting up the screen for a 4th time, and her thumb hovered over decline, not out of anger, not even out of fear exactly, but out of something quieter and more dangerous. The conviction that some doors, once they close, are kinder left that way. You don't owe him an answer, she told herself. You don't owe that house anything. You gave it everything you had, and it still let 2 strangers drag you out the front gate. Her thumb moved toward the red circle. And then, unbidden, she thought of a small hand reaching for hers in a garden. 2 claps, a pause. More. The first word a silent boy had ever trusted anyone enough to say. She thought of him at the top of those stairs, screaming her name into a house that had never taught him any other word worth screaming. She had told him, once, without quite meaning to make it a promise. I'm not going anywhere. She had broken that promise the moment the gate shut, not by choice, but the boy on the other side of that gate had no way of knowing the difference between couldn't and bad wouldn't. She lowered the phone, unanswered, and sat very still in the kitchen for a long time, the rain easing outside, her aunt humming somewhere in the next room. The whole quiet weight of a decision settling over her like a second skin. She didn't decline the call. She let it ring out, and when it stopped, she didn't delete the number. That was as far as her courage would stretch that morning. It would have to be enough, for now, to leave the door unlocked rather than open it herself. It was enough, in the end, because 3 days later, she didn't need to answer a phone at all. A black car pulled up outside her aunt's gate on a Friday afternoon, dust rising off the dirt road in a way that drew half the street to their windows, and Amahel, sweeping the front step, looked up to see Kang Min Jae step out of it, into a country that had never once seen him, in a suit entirely wrong for the heat, looking more uncertain than she had ever once seen him look in his own marble hallways. Behind him, small and solemn and holding tight to Mr. Choi's hand, stood Jun Woo. Her broom fell. Min Jae crossed the yard slowly, the whole street watching now, her aunt appearing in the doorway with a hand pressed to her mouth, and stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to speak, far enough to leave the choice entirely hers. I was wrong, he said. No preamble, no defense, the words coming out rough, like they'd been waiting a long time to be said properly. I doubted you when you'd given me nothing but the truth. I let a man I trusted for the wrong reasons take something I should never have let go of. His voice caught. I'm sorry, Amahle. In front of your family, in front of your home. I needed you to hear it here, where you come from, not in some house that never once made you feel like you belonged. The street had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet a small community makes when it senses something it will be retelling for years. And Oh Tae-sung? Amahle asked, voice steadier than she felt. Exposed, removed, handed to the people whose job it is to deal with men like him properly. Min Jae's jaw tightened. He stole from a fund my wife built with her own hands. He stole 3 years of my son's life, telling me hope wasn't worth chasing. He stole you from this house with a lie I should have seen through in a single afternoon, and didn't, because I let fear make my decisions instead of you. Amahle's eyes burned, but she held his gaze the same patient way she'd once held Jun Woo's. You came all this way to tell me that. I came all this way, Min Jae said. Because my son hasn't smiled since the morning you left, and because I haven't been able to stop thinking about a woman who danced in an empty room and changed both our lives without once asking for anything in return. He took one more step, close now, close enough that the whole street saw the moment his hand reached for hers and stopped, hovering, asking without words for permission she hadn't given yet. I'm not here as your employer, Amahle. I came to ask if there's any room left, in this life you're building, for both of us. It was Jun-woo who answered first. He let go of Mr. Choi's hand and ran. Really ran. The way he'd never let himself run in front of strangers, arms wide, straight across the dusty yard, and crashed into Amahle with the full, unguarded force of a boy who'd spent 3 weeks believing he'd never get to do this again. "Amahle," he said into her shoulder, muffled, certain, and then, in a voice that broke something open in everyone watching, in a word he had clearly been practicing alone in his room every single night since she'd left, he said it. "Mom?" Amahle went still, every part of her, and then her arms closed around him so tight, her aunt later said she'd never seen a body shake that hard without making a sound. The street around them, neighbors, school children, an old man who'd known her since she was the gap-toothed girl in that photograph, wept openly, unself-consciously, the way only a community that has shared every part of someone's grief knows how to share their joy. Over the boy's head, Amahel looked at Min-jae, who was no longer trying very hard to hide that his own eyes had gone wet, and understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like coming home, that whatever this was, wherever it would go, it was hers to choose now, freely, without a gate or a doubt or a debt standing between them. "Yes," she said, before he'd even finished asking the question properly. "There's room." 7 months after that afternoon in the dusty yard, the wedding happened on a stretch of Durban beach Amahle had played on as a girl, the late afternoon light turning everything gold the way it had the day she'd left for the airport 8 months before all of this began. There was a Korean ceremony at dawn, quiet and formal. Min-jae, in pale blue hanbok, bowing low before his elders, the scent of incense and rice wine carried on an ocean breeze that had never touched that particular ritual before. And there was, in the afternoon, the wedding her mother would have wanted for her, drums and ululation, her church choir singing the same rolling rhythmic songs that had once drawn a silent boy across an empty banquet hall, Pastor Emmanuel pronouncing them married, in English, and Isi Zulu both, the whole congregation on their feet. Jun-woo, now 11, stood beside his father as best man, in a small hanbok jacket over South African beadwork, his new grandmother, Amahle's aunt, who'd claimed the title before anyone had thought to ask her, had strung for him herself. 3 months before the wedding, a letter had arrived at the school in Durban, Hanbit Ubuntu Children's Fund, fully restored, every embezzled cent recovered through the financial crimes case against Oh Tae-sung, and matched, quietly, by Min-jae himself. The fund's scholarship roster expanded from 4 students to 40, a new classroom wing under construction with a small brass plaque already cast for its door. In memory of Kang Seo-yeon, who believed every child deserved a chance to be found. Amahel had stood in that half-built classroom 2 days before her wedding, watching a row of children not unlike the 12-year-old girl in that old photograph, and had finally, fully, let herself believe that the debt she'd carried without a name for 12 years had been paid back into the world, whole. That evening, at the reception beneath strung lights and a sky going violet over the Indian Ocean, the band, half Korean musicians Min-jae had flown in, half local players Amahle had grown up listening to, began to play. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jun-woo, 11 years old and steady in a way no one in that house would ever have predicted 3 years earlier, walked onto the dance floor alone, turned, and held out both hands, one toward his father, one toward his mother. "Dance with me," he said, clear and unafraid, the words of a boy who had learned, in the hardest possible way, that some things are worth asking for out loud. Min-jae took his son's hand, Amahle took the other, and there, on a beach 2,000 kilometers from where it all began, father, son, and mother moved together to a rhythm that belonged equally to both their worlds. Min-jae watched his wife laugh as Jun-woo spun himself dizzy between them, and let himself remember, fully, without the old grief attached to it, a night 1.5 years ago when he'd frozen in a doorway and watched his silent son dance for the first time, and had given, on instinct, the only order in his life he'd never once regretted. "Bring that girl to me," he murmured, too quiet for anyone but himself to hear, smiling in a way 3 years of silence had once made him forget how to do. It had turned out to be the best decision he ever made. That's where we leave them, on a beach, under string lights, a boy who once couldn't speak now laughing loud enough to carry over the waves. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, do me a favor. Hit like. Tell me in the comments which moment got you the most, and subscribe so you're here for the next one. Thank you for staying till the end. I'll see you in the next story.